In a few centuries, this exact spot will command an empire that reaches from the deserts of Egypt to the cold rivers of Britain. You're standing on a muddy bend in a river. The water runs brown and slow past your feet. Around you rise a handful of low hills, covered in scrub, and between them, the ground is soft, flooded marsh. There is no road here, no wall, no name. In a few centuries, this exact spot will command an empire that reaches from the deserts of Egypt to the cold rivers of Britain, and more than 1 million people will crowd onto the hills you are looking at right now. So why here? Why this swampy bend and these 7 scruffy hills and nowhere else along the long coast of Italy? Look down at the land. The answer is hiding in the shape of it. Start with the river. This is the Tiber, the 3rd longest river in Italy, and it has been carving this valley for a very long time. A river is a road that moves. It carries boats and goods and people inland from the sea without anyone building a thing. But a river is also a wall. It is deep, it is wide, and for an army or a trader on foot, crossing it is slow and dangerous. Now look at something in the middle of the water, a small island. That island, you will one day call it Tiber Island, sits right where the river is easiest to cross. It splits the current into 2 shallow channels, and it turns an impossible river into a place you can wade and later bridge. This is the lowest natural crossing of the Tiber before the river reaches the sea. Everyone moving up or down the coast of Italy, and everyone hauling goods inland from the water, is funneled to this one spot. Do you see what that means? Whoever holds this crossing holds the traffic of a whole region. And there is a second kind of traffic here, older than any city: salt. At the mouth of the Tiber, where the river meets the sea, salt water sits in shallow pans. The sun burns it off, and white salt is left behind. In the ancient world, salt was not a seasoning. It was how you kept meat and fish from rotting through the winter. It was survival, and it was money. An old track ran from those coastal salt pans, up along the river, into the mountains where the inland tribes could not make their own. You can still trace that road today. The Romans called it the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, and it crossed the river right here. So this muddy bend is not random at all. It is the exact point where the coast route, the inland salt route, and the river highway all meet and cross. Now look up at the hills. There are 7 of them, and they matter as much as the water. In a world with no police and no lasting peace, high ground is life. From a hilltop, you can see an enemy coming while he is still far off. You can throw rocks down at anyone climbing toward you. The steep sides do the work of a wall you never had to build. One hill stands out, the Palatine. It has steep flanks, a flat top wide enough to live on, and a clear view over the river crossing below. This is where the story says it began, traditionally in the year 753, before the Common Era, when a settlement first took root on the Palatine's flat crown. Farmers and herders, watching the crossing, holding the high ground. Around them lived the other tribes of central Italy, the Latins on the plain, the Sabines in the hills to the northeast, and the powerful Etruscans across the river to the north. But a scatter of villages on separate hills is not a city yet. So how did 7 hilltops become one Rome? The answer is the low, wet ground in the middle. That marshy valley between the hills was useless, flooded, good for nothing but frogs and mud, until someone drained it. Around 600 before the Common Era, under the rule of Etruscan kings, the Romans dug one of the ancient world's great feats of engineering, the Colca Maxima, the Great Drain. It pulled the standing water out of the valley and carried it down to the Tiber, and the drained mud dried into solid, shared ground. That dry valley floor became the forum, the common meeting place, the market, the law courts, the temples, the beating center where people from every hill came together as one. The drain made the city. Think about that for a moment. The heart of Rome is a swamp that somebody decided to empty. Now the growth begins, and you can watch it spread across the land like ink soaking into paper. First, the hills fill in with houses and shrines. Then a wall rings the whole cluster, the Servian Wall, thrown up in the 4th century before the Common Era after a shock. A raiding army of Gauls had sacked the young city, and Rome swore it would never be caught open again. Then roads push out from the crossing, straight and stubborn, marching in every direction across Italy. All roads lead to Rome was never just a saying, it was a literal map. The empire's roads were spokes on a wheel, and this river crossing was the hub at the center. And here comes the turning point, the single advantage that lifted a hill town above every other city on Earth: position. Rome sits about 15 miles up the river from the open sea, close enough to reach the Mediterranean and everything its water touched, but far enough inland to be safe from the pirate fleets that raided the exposed coasts. It had the trade of a great port, without the danger of one. From this protected middle ground, Rome swallowed first its neighbors, then the whole Italian peninsula, then the entire ring of the Mediterranean, until the Romans simply called that sea our sea. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, more than 1 million people lived here. That had never happened before, not anywhere on the planet. Do you understand how strange that number was? For more than 1,000 years afterward, no other city on Earth would grow large enough to match it. Feeding 1 million people on 7 hills should have been impossible. The fields around Rome could never grow enough grain to feed a crowd that size. So the empire fed its capital by sea. Grain fleets from Egypt and North Africa sailed to the river mouth at Ostia, the city's port. Then, the sacks were carried up the Tiber to the hungry hills. Water came the same way the roads did, engineered in. 11 aqueducts, long stone channels running for miles across the countryside, riding those famous arches, carried millions of gallons a day, so that people living on high, dry hilltops could drink and bathe. The geography that made Rome safe also made it thirsty, and Roman engineering answered the problem. Then, the empire fell, and watch what happens to the map now. The grain fleets stop coming. The aqueducts are cut and run dry. Without them, the hills can no longer support a crowd, and the people drift down off the heights toward the river and the one thing that still works: the Tiber and its ancient crossing. The city that once held 1 million people shrinks, over centuries, to perhaps 30,000. Cattle graze among the fallen columns of the Forum. But it never dies. Why not? Because the crossing is still the crossing. The river is still the road. And a new power has planted its flag on these hills, the popes, who make Rome the center of a faith instead of the capital of an empire, and pull pilgrims and money back toward the 7 hills. The Renaissance then rebuilds the city in stone and marble and fountains. And in 1871, when the scattered kingdoms and city-states of Italy finally joined together into one nation, they choose their capital with almost no argument. Of course, it is Rome. It always had been the center. The land had decided that quietly, 2,000 years before anyone was asked. Today, more than 4 million people live across the city and the sprawl around it. The 7 hills are still there, buried under palaces and churches and apartment blocks and traffic. The Forum is a sunken field of broken marble you can walk down into. And the Tiber still bends, brown and slow, past a small island in the middle of the water. You're standing on that same muddy bend. You just cannot see it anymore. The marsh is drained, the salt road is paved over, the 7 quiet hills are smothered in a living city. But every one of them is still down there, still holding up the weight of everyone who came, because the land itself told them exactly where to stand.